Hello again, everybody, and welcome back. I'm Logan Albright, back with another book review for your viewing pleasure. And before we get started, I just want to thank you all for subscribing to my channel. I hit 1,000 subscribers over the last few days, and I'm very pleased with that. So thanks for watching. It means a lot. Now, one of my viewers wanted me to talk about Frankenstein, and I don't actually have a copy of it on me, but it's October, and I've read it twice before, so I can easily talk about it. And I think it's a really interesting book. And one of the things I want to talk about is the idea of allegory and themes in a novel. I should start out by saying that I'm not really a fan of allegory. I prefer stories that stand on their own 2 feet. They just want to tell a story, and they may have themes in them, but they're not specifically intended to be allegorical. Professor Jordan Peterson talks about the difference between propaganda and art. And propaganda is when you're trying to put forward a specific message, whether it's a political message or something, and that's the purpose of the story you're telling. Whereas art is you're telling the story for its own sake, you're trying to be truthful, you're trying to be entertaining, and those themes emerge organically. And I think that's really important because when you have something that is propagandistic and is trying to be overly allegorical, it's always one-dimensional. It has the message that it's intended to have, and that's it. There's nothing else that goes along with it. Whereas a truthfully observed artistic novel that's where you're just trying to tell the truth and you're trying to be entertaining, it's going to have various levels of interpretation. It's going to have various levels of themes, various ways to look at the characters, various ways to look at the plot, and you're going to be able to pull out interpretations of it that the author didn't necessarily intend. And I think that's a difference between a good novel and a hacky novel. And I think Frankenstein by Mary Shelley is a fantastic novel, and let's get into some of the reasons why and some of the themes you can pull out. Frankenstein was written by Mary Shelley in 1818, and it's one of the first modern horror novels, one of the first modern science fiction novels. It's debatable whether you want to classify it as horror or science fiction because it certainly has a science base. Movies have kind of drifted it into horror over the course of time, but it's really both, and it's very inventive. And everybody knows the plot. It's about a doctor, Victor Frankenstein, who discovers that he can stitch body parts of cadavers together and bring them to life with electricity and create life. And then he creates this Frankenstein's monster, and the monster turns on him, and they end up trying to kill each other. Pretty straightforward plot with some inventive elements of science that are, for the early 19th century, pretty inventive. But the thing that's really cool about it is all of the little themes you can pull out and all the different kind of metaphors and interpretations you can pull out of the thing. I think if you wanted to look at it as an allegory, which I don't think it's intended to be, I think it's intended to be just a story. The story goes that she, came up with this during a storm on a night when her and Percy Shelley and a bunch of other people were sitting around trying to make up stories to scare each other. She just kind of came up with the first idea for this. I think it's just intended to be that, but you can certainly look at it in a variety of ways. The most obvious example is probably a metaphor for bad parenting, or child abuse. Frankenstein brings his monster into the world and then immediately forgets about him and doesn't care about him and kind of neglects him and abuses him. He regards him as someone who's not fully a person, not someone who's really worthy of respect or protection. And, of course, the monster then turns on him because he's been brought into the world against his will, and he's been shown no love and no affection, and he doesn't have a wife, and he doesn't have any prospects, and the world is against him, and he becomes very bitter because, when you create life, that's a responsibility. And the doctor kind of doesn't accept that responsibility. After he's done with the experiment, he's like, okay, I'm done with that, and moves on to other things. And the monster's still there, and he's got to... I hate calling him the monster, but he doesn't have a name in the book. Some people have called him Adam in other adaptations, but I think in the book he doesn't actually have a name. So I'll just call him the monster without wanting that to be a value judgment on him. So I think, you could see it as a metaphor for bad parenting. And there's been some feminist critique of the novel where a feminist writer said that this is what happens when a man tries to have a baby without a woman. Is it's too much masculine energy, not enough feminine influence, and you create this monster. And I think that's a really interesting interpretation. But that's only one way to look at it. You can look at it as in other ways as well. You could see it as an allegory for racism. The monster is different than his peers and his contemporaries, and everyone regards him as less than human because of that, because of his difference. And he's shunned by society and treated poorly because of that. That could be seen as an allegory of race relations, certainly, and of slavery, things like that, if you wanted to look at it those ways. You can even look at it as having themes that didn't exist at the time, but in retrospect, now that it's a couple hundred years later, you can find these themes. I was thinking about this video and the plot and all the themes that come out of it, and I started thinking about the eugenics movement and kind of Nietzsche's philosophy of the Übermensch and the Superman. And Nietzsche was born 25 years after this novel came out. The eugenics movement didn't start until even later, but I think you certainly see that, this idea of trying to create a more perfect type of human, a more perfect species, trying to perfect the species through science, through, in the case of eugenics, it's selective breeding, but in the case of Frankenstein, it's through, the direct application of science to building a more stronger, better type of person, because the monster is, of course, incredibly strong, incredibly physically powerful. And you can see it as a warning against that kind of playing God and trying to engineer a more perfect human being. Of course, Mary Shelley couldn't have had that as an intention when she wrote the book, because eugenics hadn't started yet, Nietzsche hadn't been born yet. But that's what I love about great literature, is that you can find these themes that are timeless, that come out even if the author had no way of knowing about them or intending them. Just because you're observing the world and telling the truth about the world, you're going to find things that keep coming up over and over again, these patterns that you can read into the novel. So I think that's really interesting. And I love the novel because it's got so many layers. Going back to the child abuse or child neglect thing, there's a story, it's a book and a movie. I haven't read the book, but I've seen the movie, called We Need to Talk About Kevin. And one of the themes of that movie, there's probably multiple ways to read it, but one of the ways that you can read it that I find particularly interesting is the idea of what happens if you don't show a difficult child enough love or affection, and you treat them differently because they're difficult, how you risk creating a monster. And that's what happens in that story. And it's the extent to which it's his lack of love or it's innate is debatable, but that's one way to read it. I think that's a very good parallel with Frankenstein. You have this creation, this monster you brought into the world, who's difficult and angry and resentful and confused about why he's there. And instead of trying to realize that he's a person who needs help and needs love and needs affection, you just kind of dismiss him. You end up creating a monster. So I think those kind of parallels are there too. You can also see it as a story of revenge and a warning against the possibility of revenge. At the end of the book, Frankenstein and the monster have completely abandoned everything in life except for trying to get each other. They've been completely taken over by their obsession and by their hatred, and there's nothing else left. It's burned everything else to the ground. And you can see that, it's a cycle where one of them goes after the other, and then there's retaliation, and it goes back and forth, and it's this feud, and it just escalates and gets worse and worse and worse. And you could see it as a warning against revenge. That's another theme you can pick up on in the novel. But one of my favorite things about the novel to think about is the subtitle, which is infrequently mentioned. People don't usually talk about it, but the full name of the novel is Frankenstein or the Modern Prometheus. The Modern Prometheus is a really interesting subtitle to give this story, and I think it tells a lot about Shelley's mindset at the time. Prometheus, of course, was in Greek mythology the Titan who stole fire from the gods and gave it to humans. And he was punished for that. The gods strapped him to a rock and had an eagle pick out his liver with its beak for eternity until Hercules rescued him. And there's a couple ways to read that story. And I think, in my personal view, I've always loved the story of Prometheus because I view him as a liberator. I view him as an advocate for mankind. I view him as someone who appreciates the value of human freedom and responsibility. Fire is a dangerous tool. Fire can be used for destruction, but fire can also be used for creation. And in giving that to mankind, he's taking a risk. He's realizing that this is a weapon that can be used for evil, or it's a tool that can be used for good. But it's up to mankind to determine their own destiny, and it's not up for the gods to treat us like children. And for that, the gods punish him, but mankind is grateful. And Prometheus is kind of seen as a hero figure in this. And I think that's how I view him. I think he's a liberator. I think he's a great advocate for mankind. I love that. But you can also view the story differently, and I feel like Mary Shelley was probably viewing the story differently as well. One way of seeing Frankenstein as the modern Prometheus is this forbidden knowledge. He is, you could view him heroically. You could say, he is a person who sees further than his contemporaries. He sees into the future. He sees what's possible. He is a man of genius, of vision, and he creates something, and he's misunderstood. And all of his peers and all of his family revile him for it, and they think that he's done something unnatural, and they cast him out of society. And he's sort of a victim in that, a victim of his own genius. You could see him as sort of an Ayn Rand style superhero who's just misunderstood by society. And but I think it's hard to have that interpretation because Victor Frankenstein in the novel is not a great guy. He does a lot of bad things. He makes a lot of questionable decisions. And so instead of viewing Prometheus in this regard as a hero, I think that Mary Shelley must have had a different view, because the other way you can view Prometheus is analogous to the serpent in the Garden of Eden story, where you have the tempter who says, this is forbidden knowledge, the knowledge of good and evil. This is knowledge that is best left to the gods, and it's not meant for mankind. And you took it anyway, and you gave it to mankind, and the results were disastrous. That's sort of another, I mean, those two stories are analogous. The Prometheus and the Garden of Eden myth are similar. The interesting thing is that in the Garden of Eden, the serpent is regarded as the villain, and in Prometheus, he's regarded as the hero. But you can certainly see Frankenstein in that sort of villainy role. He's tampered with forbidden knowledge that man was never meant to have. He's playing God, and in doing so, trying to steal forbidden knowledge from the gods and bring it to mankind. He's created an unnatural thing that comes back to bite him, in the same way that Prometheus's actions come back to bite him in terms of his punishment. So that's one way to look at that. It's also got a little bit of the Faust legend in there. You know, the Faust legend is that Faust wanted supernatural knowledge. He wanted eternal life. He wanted to know more than his contemporaries could know, and so he makes a deal with the devil in order to get those things and sells his soul. And that's a legend that has been, you know, very popular and promulgated throughout history for many hundreds of years. Mary Shelley was doubtless familiar with the story. It was really popular in the 19th century. So you can view Victor Frankenstein as a Faust figure who makes a bargain with the devil in exchange for forbidden knowledge, and then has his soul taken from him as a result. And that is the end of his fate in the book, is that he's become a soulless, revenge-seeking monster, just like the person he created. There's also this parallelism, this duality between the monster and the creator, where which one is the real monster? You know, is it really the innocent who was created against his will and brought into the world with nothing? Or is it the person who created him and then abandoned him and abused him? Who's the real monster? Are they really the same? Are they the same character? Is there a difference between them? There's ways to look at it. And so there's all these different interpretations. You can interpret Frankenstein as a good guy or as a bad guy. You can interpret the monster as a good guy or as a bad guy. You can find all these little allegorical themes sprinkled throughout the book. And that's what makes it a great book, is that it's not a propaganda piece that's designed to push one message on you. It's a really interesting story about the human condition, about science, about technology, about man's place in the universe, about parenthood, about relationships, about everything. And because it's about all those things, and because it's just trying to tell a story, you can pull out all these themes and find something that speaks to you and find an interpretation that works for you. And that makes it enduring in a way that a propaganda piece would never be enduring. It makes it last for 200 years, and we're still talking about it today. That's why I think it's such a great book. And a lot of the movie adaptations really smooth off the rough edges of this book and reduce it to a one-dimensional monster story. And the original novel, if you haven't read it, is so much more complex and deep, and it's not very long. It's like 200 pages long. It's a very small book, but it's got a lot packed in there. And so I hadn't thought about it in a while, and I'm pleased, I'm grateful to my viewer for pointing out that I should do Frankenstein, because now that I sit down and think about it, it is an amazing book and has a lot to think about. And it's a great Halloween read. If you know, now that it's October, if you want to pick up something to read, that would be a good choice, because if you haven't read it, it really holds up. It's a great story. I want to do a couple more Halloween-themed videos in the next few weeks, so I'm going to do some ghost story lists. I might do another scary novel if I come up with a good idea for one. So I'm going to try to pad out the rest of October with Halloween-themed videos, Halloween-themed literature. So I hope you'll stay tuned for that. I've been Logan Albright. This has been another one of my book reviews. Please stop back anytime. I'd love to have you. And if you haven't subscribed, be sure to click that subscribe button. Leave me comments down below. I'll respond, and I'll catch you next time. Thanks so much for watching.